Thank you for joining us. The program will begin shortly. Welcome to the trials and tribulations of the new school year, understanding and breaking through the conflict and controversies over masks, vaccines, and critical race theory, presented by the USC Rossier School of Education. Before we begin, I would like to review the process for submitting questions. Please start submitting your questions by adding them to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will use these questions and the ones submitted in advance to facilitate today's discussion. We hope to get to as many as possible. Closed captioning is available for this event. Please use the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen to access it. Lastly, please note a recording of this webinar will be available after the event. Now, please welcome the Emery Stoops and Joyce King Stoops Dean of the USC Rossier School of Education, Pedro Noguera.
Thank you, and good afternoon, all of you, and thank you for joining us today for what we think is going to be a really important conversation. As many of you know, this start of this school year has been like none other. School boards and superintendents are on the front lines of many pitched battles and controversies, and these have grown increasingly heated, so much so that we've seen calls for help in many districts and even threats of violence. To shed light on the controversies and also to help us understand what might be done to begin to address the issues that have been raised, we've assembled a panel of experts locally, drawing on our talent here at USC. I'd like to introduce our panelists today. They are first Professor Shaun Harper. He is the Provost Professor of USC Rossier and also the founder of and Executive Director of the USC Race and Equity Center. Thank you for joining us, Professor Harper. Sandra Lyon, who is a retired superintendent from Palm Springs Unified School District. She was formerly in Santa Monica, Malibu, and is also on our faculty in the Education Leadership Program at Rossier. Professor Julie Marsh, who is a professor of education policy at USC Rossier and the faculty director of policy analysis for California Education. And then finally, Professor Neeraj Sood, who is the vice dean of research at the USC Sol Price School of Public Policy and the director of the COVID initiative at the USC Schaefer Center for Health Policy and Economics. Thank you all for being with us. What we'd like to do is to open up with Professor Marsh, who's going to make some remarks to start us out about what the polling data and the public is saying about the current controversies. So Professor Marsh, why don't you get us started?
Great, thank you so much, Pedro. It's nice to be here. So I wanted to first start with some of the data that we have from our annual PACE USC Rossier poll of registered California voters that was done at the end of May. And it shows us several things. The first thing is that voters are generally worried about the effects of the pandemic on students, particularly around academics and social and emotional well-being. But despite the sort of challenges that they're seeing this past year, they actually very much appreciate the work of educators. So more than half are giving an A or B grade to their local public schools, which is actually higher than what we've seen in the past. 67% were giving an A or B rating to their local public school teachers. So this is good news. The second is that there's this polarization. So not only did we see huge partisan divides in just about every question we asked on the poll, but the vast majority of voters are actually aware of these divisions. So 78% said that they agreed California has become more divided politically. 70% said that the state has become more divided on matters of race. The third thing I want to call out is that we've asked opinions about the district leaders and board members, and voters, particularly voters with children, rated them as generally effective and believe that they have a very critical role to play. But the voter support drops when we frame this around the pandemic and the performance that's going on during the pandemic. So for example, 58% believe that local boards were effectively managing schools generally, but only 45% agreed that this was true in the pandemic. And this is likely due to a host of efforts and issues. I mean, we could talk about the media attention to these events that Pedro was referring to, the frustration with the pandemic and the lack of in-person instruction, not understanding fully all the constraints that districts are under, including union negotiations, changing state guidelines, limited information. And I think, so some would say that, right, they are the face of chaos, but they might not actually be the source of that chaos. The fourth thing I want to point out has to do with this increase in involvement in educational issues during the pandemic. So some voters, particularly parents and high-income voters, were reporting that they're following the news more carefully on education issues. They're contacting local officials, attending board meetings. And what stood out to us was actually why they're getting more involved. One of the reasons, more than 40% said it was just that these issues had become more prominent in the news. But the other one is that more than 40% said it was due to the dissatisfaction that they had with the quality of education and their unhappiness with the educational decisions that are being made during the pandemic. And this dissatisfaction rationale was actually strongest among our lower income voters, Black and Latinx voters. And it's this dissatisfaction combined with the polarization that we see playing out in these highly charged board meetings and in recalls of school board members. In Ballotpedia, there was an LA Times article over the weekend, an editorial that counted 67 recalls targeting 174 board members in 2021. That's more than twice the normal numbers, and it's a third of those are in California. I just want to take one moment and talk about the folks in school systems. I know Sandy's going to get to this, but I've been doing research with my students and colleagues around the country. I'm also teaching in the EDD program, lots of educators and leaders, and they are exhausted. They also feel caught in the middle of these crossfires of something much bigger, right? The culture wars, the polarization and the politicization of COVID, efforts to roll back racial progress in our society. And leaders in particular feel that they can't win. They feel that if they take, at the state level, if they take decisive action, they'll be criticized for taking away local control. But if they don't do anything, then they're not fulfilling their job. Board members similarly feel that they can't please all the stakeholders and that they're being blamed for conditions that really aren't under their control. And district administrators feel that state leaders have evaded their responsibilities and they're leaving them to make these really difficult decisions. So the controversies that we're talking about today in this panel have made an already really challenging job of leading and educating in a pandemic even more challenging. And we're seeing the effects of this play out in retirements and resignations and shortages and mental health concerns. And so for me, all of this raises really important questions about the health of our school system and democratic institutions. Are these recalls and shouting matches the way that we want the public and our parents to be engaged in our schools? And what does it mean for the governance and well-being of our schools if people are only involved when they're unhappy, if their self-interest is dominating over a commitment to the common good? And if we can't bridge these deep, deep political divides where personal ideology and values leave little room for dialogue and conversation? And on the district side, how do we balance safety and security with the need to hear from the community? And how can we accomplish anything if our leaders and educators are worn out and our worse are checking out? So I'm hoping that the conversation that we have today might address some of those issues, and I'm happy to delve more into some of the particulars of these controversies as we continue on.
Thank you, Julie, and thanks for laying out so many really important questions. Having once been an elected board member myself, where most people, at most we have 4 or 5 people at a board meeting, I can only imagine how hard it is right now to serve. Let's turn to Sandy Lyon. Sandy, you've been on the front line and you know what it's like to be faced with these controversies from your experience, and you're in touch with other superintendents and board members around the state. Let's hear your perspective of what's happening out there.
Thank you, Pedro. And Julie's really laid out, I think, already so many of the things that we want to talk about today. I had the great privilege of being a superintendent for 13 years in very different communities with very different needs and different students. I was 5 years in Palm Springs, where I retired in July, 5 years in Santa Monica, Malibu, and 3 years in one school district, Hughes Elizabeth Lakes. So that background and experience really helped me sort of understand a variety of community needs. I can say in my career, I had many trials and tribulations as a superintendent, and I had a lot of joys and successes too. And having been a sitting superintendent during the pandemic, I can tell you that those were some of the most challenging months in the year and a half of my time in that seat. As Julie's alluded to, one of the big issues right now is the politicization and the emotionally fraught environment that we're working in. During the pandemic, superintendents were put in the position of making very difficult decisions. They were in unwinnable situations. They had to make decisions in a rapidly changing environment about health and health policy. And there were people on all sides of those issues with their own viewpoints. And I think one of the things that Julie mentioned that I just want to talk about today is this dissatisfaction with public schools in general also stems from this idea of how do we get people more engaged before we have a crisis. And I hope we get to touch on that a little bit today. My friend Carl Cohn, my friend and colleague, he recently wrote a piece for the American Association of School Administrators about the topic. And in it, he describes how superintendents became the face of the pandemic. They became the face of these very difficult decisions, this once in a century catastrophe. And his piece really illuminates the strange relationships between superintendents, boards, and their communities that have emerged over masking and vaccinations, but also as during this time, we've addressed issues of racial discrimination and working to not just address equity, diversity, and inclusion, but really create anti-racist organizations. And those conversations are being held and challenged in boardrooms across the state and across the country, often with misinformation and done in a fashion that lacks civility and dismantles discourse. And I think that's something that we all need to be very concerned about and something we need to strategize about how do we create that safe environment. Just today, it was reported that the CSBA, the California School Boards Association, is actually urging Governor Newsom to provide protection by law enforcement to education officials, citing the risk of assault and abuse from protesters opposed to both pandemic policies and other issues that are cropping up in those boardrooms. And Vernon Billy, the CEO of the organization, said, a simple scan of the news or conversations with school board trustees from any part of California will confirm that what we are seeing goes far beyond the normal legal expression of First Amendment rights, which is to be encouraged and embraced. I agree with him. I think it is a scary situation, and yet how do we protect that fundamental right of a community to participate in those local decision-making opportunities that are happening in those school boards? So I think this is something that we've got to start to grapple with and support folks who are doing it. So it's even more clear to me now how vital our public schools are in the future of all of our students, and that's an emphasis on all, and also to the communities that they serve. And if we're going to successfully navigate these trials and tribulations and the ones that we're going to face in the future, we really have to talk about how we're going to sustainably fund and protect our public school systems, how we're going to train, attract, recruit, retain highly qualified educational professionals, and how we're going to create environments that respect and protect our school staff and elected officials as they're vital to our future and our democracy. And I worry right now about who those leaders are going to be, who is going to want to step up to the plate in this fraught environment where people are being attacked, harassed, and threatened on a regular basis. So in my mind, this is about protecting the future of our democracy, our future in general. And really, I'm worried about how we protect the future of public education in California.
Thank you, Sandy. And I'm not going to ask you if you stop being a superintendent because of all these threats and controversies, but we'll come back to you in a little while. Let's talk to Niraj. And Niraj, as we know, the controversies over masks and vaccines have been at the center of some of this polarization, not just in schools, but throughout our country. can you shed some light on these issues as someone who's been studying them closely as a research scientist?
Thank you, Pedro. So, I want to start by talking about some kind of general principles on the way we should kind of think about any decision making related to COVID in schools, because this is not a problem that's going away. We are going to face these trials and tribulations in the future. So how do we kind of think about that? So my first principle, and these are kind of some principles I use in my own research to, or I've been using in my own decision making to think about, either public policy more generally, or also just decisions about my own family and what we should do. So the first principle I kind of use is that we have to think long term. So back in February or March last year, we were in a crisis mode because this was a new virus that we knew nothing about, and it was causing a lot of mortality, hospitalization, illness, and we really didn't know how deadly it was, how contagious it was. So that response during that crisis was very different, or should be very different than our response now. Now we know this virus. It's been there for 18 to 20 months. Do we know everything about it? No. But what is the expectation that this is going to disappear in the next few months? Zero. So this is a virus that's here to stay with us. Most scientists think that this is something that's going to become endemic. So we got to think about decision making truly in the long run, and not like, what am I going to do for the next 4 weeks, or for the next month, or for the next 2 months? We really got to be thinking about, how am I going to live with this virus for the next 5 years, or maybe longer? And that changes how you view certain decisions. So think about that. The second thing was, again, this is kind of crisis versus no crisis, is that we got to start thinking about overall well-being. So when the virus first emerged, the only thing we cared about was COVID cases, COVID deaths, COVID hospitalizations, because this was a new thing. We were doing everything to kind of lower those numbers. But now, if this is a longer term problem, we really got to think about the entire well-being of the child. So that comes to, there is going to be a trade-off between public health and education. There might be certain decisions you make that promote public health, but hurt education. And you need to recognize those trade-offs. You cannot dismiss them and say there is no trade-off, and I'm just going to focus on one or the other. There is a trade-off. So recognizing those, thinking about the entire well-being of the child. So not just COVID, anxiety, depression, child's emotional well-being, their education. You got to think about everything and think about that as a longer-term problem. The third kind of principle I use is that you got to know the facts, and you got to, like, in some sense, do a deep dive, which means if you read a New York Times story on something, that's not the fact. You got to go to the CDC website, check out the data. You got to go to the American Academy of Pediatrics website, check out the data. You might have to, read opinions from, both the right and the left, and then try to make up your mind. Because a lot of times what we do is we've already made a decision, and then we go look for facts that support our decision. And I think we gotta really make an attempt. And I think I do that. Every human does that. Like, we have this bias in our decision making. And in some sense, what psychologists have found out is that the smarter you are, the easier it is for you to rationalize your decisions and find facts that support your decisions. So I think it takes discipline to really try to put your beliefs aside and really look at the facts in as objective a way as possible. Look at arguments from both sides of the aisle or both sides of the argument, and then try to make up your mind about, what to do. And then I think there is a question of ethics, which was partly ignored in the pandemic, which is we cannot do any decision which harms children where there is no benefit to the child, or where the harms to the child outweigh the benefits to the child. So, for example, in the pandemic, initially school closures were justified on the ground, not that it will help the children or prevent COVID cases in children, but because it will prevent COVID transmission in the community. And I think you need a very high bar of evidence. First, I think it's unethical to burden children for the benefit of adults. But even if you want to do that, like if there is any potential harm to the children, we have to have a very high burden of evidence to show that there are going to be big long-term benefits to the children and so on. So I think with children, we got to be very careful about causing potential harm to them. And they don't have a voice in this decision making. So we as adults really need to be cognizant of that. And I think the last thing I would say is, there are a lot of controversies around what we should do. There are no easy answers here, right? I don't know the answer. So, Pedro, to your question, like, should we wear mask or no mask, or should we vaccinate or not vaccinate? I can give you my opinion on it. I can give you my judgment on it, but I cannot say, like, I cannot go stand on a bully pulpit and say, this is absolutely the right decision and everyone else should follow me. I can kind of give you my opinion on it, and we can have a discussion about, whether it makes sense or not and how I'm thinking about that decision. So I don't think there are any easy answers here. And the reason is, first, there's uncertainty in science or the evidence, right? Like, we don't know all the facts. Even if we do hundreds of studies, we're all kind of experts and scientists. We know there's always uncertainty around what we know. And the second is, it's about judgments. It's about trading off health versus education, which depends upon your individual preferences. How much risk tolerance do you have? How much do you value education versus mental health versus your child ending up in the hospital? And everyone makes those trade-offs differently. So I don't think there's going to be any clear-cut answer here for especially the controversial issues. And I'll kind of stop there.
Thank you, Niraj. And let's turn to Shaun. Shaun, as we know, race is also now right at the center of some of these controversies, and how we teach about race and critical theory suddenly is now being emerged as a K-12 issue. So can you shed some light on those controversies and how we should think about approaching them?
Sure. Thank you, Pedro, for convening us for this important conversation. Let's start by acknowledging that the attacks on critical race theory, the sudden attacks, right, are in response, it's backlash in response to the global conversation that was forced last summer following the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Those murders forced a conversation about structural and systemic racism in the US. And, it doesn't surprise me that a year later, there's just all of this frenzy around, teaching young people about race in America. Let me also say that I have used critical race theory in my research continuously for the past 18 years. I know it well. I also taught a course. I developed a course when I was on the faculty at the University of Pennsylvania in 2008, and I've taught that course continuously there at Penn and now here at USC Rossier on critical race theory. Let me just say that given my expertise on the topic, I can say declaratively that opponents are terribly uninformed. I am not at all convinced that they've read the brilliant scholarship that was produced by Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw and so many other pioneering CRT scholars. I frankly find it intellectually lazy to critique something that one has not read. It's reckless policymaking, as a matter of fact, to vote on something and legislate something that you hadn't read. So we're seeing, these bans on the teaching of CRT, in various states across the country. Simply put, these folks don't know what they're talking about. Let me also just point out here 3 logic flaws in sort of the opponent's perspectives, if you will. The first is that I know from my research and from the research that we do here at the USC Race and Equity Center that students learn very little about race in their teacher preparation programs, in their principal certification programs, or in EDD programs largely that prepare, school superintendents and so on. So the logic here, I suppose, right, is that there's a whole lot of people out there teaching something that they never learned. I don't think so. It would be like me teaching physics. I've never taken a physics course. I would be a terrible physics teacher. I think that same thing is true of the so-called, all these folks who are supposedly teaching CRT in K-12 schools across the country. I invite anybody, find me 50 teachers in K-12 schools anywhere across the US who are teaching CRT. They don't exist. Here's another sort of related logic flaw. We know that the education profession is more than 80% white. Let's take K-12 teachers, for example. More than 80% of them are white, and the overwhelming majority of them are white women. It's the logic here that there's a ton of white women, woke white women across the country, teachers, who are teaching CRT. I don't believe so. I am not convinced. Find me 50. The last logic flaw that I'll point out here is in our work here at the USC Race and Equity Center, we work with schools and K-12 school districts throughout California and elsewhere across the country. Educators and school leaders tell us actually that we don't know how to talk about race. We don't talk about it in our schools. We don't talk about it in our district meetings. We don't know how to solve complex racial problems or how to close racial equity gaps. So is the logic here then that folks who, by their own admission, don't even know how to talk about race are teaching about it? I don't believe so. So again, my perspective here is that, critical race theory is being used as a boogeyman. Like there's this boogeyman that's coming for your children. No, it's not happening. Find me 50 teachers who are teaching about CRT in K-12 schools. Here's the last thing that I'll say. I was recently on a TV show. I signed an NDA, so I can't say which one until it comes out. But I was recently on a TV show, and the whole episode was about the teaching and learning of CRT in K-12 schools. And there were some parents on there who were critics and opponents. It became painfully apparent to me within the first 30 seconds that these folks were conflating all social justice issues with CRT. One of those parents, for example, said that her daughter came home and asked, Mom, what are my pronouns? And she was really furious that her daughter came home asking what her pronouns were. Yeah, but that's not critical race theory. Sorry, that's not a part of it at all. Also, there's a conflating with, Nicole Hannah-Jones's very important, influential 1619 project. Such an important project, not critical race theory though, all right? So really anything pertaining to race or even social justice more broadly is being sort of, put into this dumpster that uninformed critics have labeled CRT. I'll just close out here by saying that I absolutely believe that America's school children deserve to learn the truth about America's racial history and America's racial presence. I feel very strongly about that. As a matter of fact, in the most recent issue of the USC Rossier magazine, I wrote a piece on teaching about the inescapable racial realities of the January 6th Capitol insurrection. I'll put a link in the chat to it. I think that children in schools deserve to understand the racialized double standard that was on full display in the Capitol insurrection. But again, let's not be intellectually lazy and just slap a critical race theory label on the teaching and learning of anything pertaining to race.
Thank you, Shaun. So I think our panelists have very effectively laid out the issues, the problems, and even started to point to some solutions. Let me turn back to Julie for a moment. Julie, because you've done this polling data. How does the public feel about mask mandates and teaching about race? Sometimes we get the sense that the loudest voices represent the majority, but what does the data show?
Yeah, thanks, Pedro. Well, on the mask one, it's interesting. Ed Week just had a survey that came out nationally representative. This was about educators, and they're actually pretty happy with the safety precautions. There's a bit of waning in the support for masks among administrators. I just read this morning. 70% support mask mandates, down from 90% last year. So that's kind of interesting. On the mask front, we were hearing in some of the schools earlier in the year when we were doing research around the buying of PPE and all the the cleansers, and people were saying, well, later the science showed that that wasn't actually as effective, right? The sort of sanitizing classrooms and things like that. But some of the leaders actually thought that this was nonetheless really valuable, that there's something about like the perception and fear, not just science, that was leading people to want to use them. So I would argue that you might say that masks are in a similar camp. On the front of vaccinations, we see a lot of support for mandates for requirements. So on our PACE Rossier poll, 69% of voters and then about 68% of parents were equally in favor. Should COVID-19 vaccine be approved by the FDA, that we should be requiring it for all students in California schools with allowable medical expense exceptions. Similarly, educators on that Ed Week poll also have strong support for mandates of vaccinations. So I would say that on these big issues, we might be hearing from folks who are opposing, but there's quite a lot of support for some of this. On the racism part, again, we didn't poll on CRT, and I agree completely with Shaun and the conflating of all this, but we have been asking, and other polls have been asking about, what do parents think? Do they want their kids to be learning about these issues? In our PACE USC Rossier poll, 72% of parents thought that schools should spend more time teaching grade appropriate lessons about the causes and consequences of racism and inequality. And then Morgan Polikoff and the colleagues at USC on the Understanding American Schools nationally representative survey, 70% of K-12 parents felt it was important for students to learn about racism in the US. We've been doing a lot of work around the country. Majority of the parents that we have been polling in Colorado, Oregon, Michigan, Louisiana, Florida, all of them are thinking that, yes, they want to be seeing schools create curriculum to teach about racism, bias, equity, and inclusion. And so again, and we've been doing a lot of interviews too with parents. And I would say that there's some nuance here. We talked to a Black mother in a high school, and we asked her about what she thought about how her school was responding to the killing of George Floyd. And she was kind of weary about the school system's capacity. And I think this is going back to Shaun's point, to really provide like culturally affirming learning environment for her children. She says she didn't really want to leave it into the hands of school folks. She wasn't sure that they would get it right, and that they would come to it with the care that she thought it needed to be treating these issues. So it's not as clear cut as that everyone says, yes, let's teach it. I think to Shaun's point, we need to make sure we're teaching it right, and we prepare educators to do so.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. And that's a good way to kind of set a context for this discussion. Sandy, when you hear from individuals, superintendents or school board members who talk about feeling beleaguered and under attack, and wondering whether or not they should give up on this job, what do you tell them? We serve a lot of students who are becoming educational leaders themselves, and they're looking at this situation. They might wonder whether or not this was the right choice. What would your advice be?
I still think, Pedro, it's one of the most noble professions that we have, and it's so important, as our panelists have talked about, how critical it is in so many discussions that we have that are going to further us as human beings. I do think that, I have a son who's in a teaching credential program right now. And so people have asked me, why are you encouraging him to do that work? Because it matters. It's really important. And so one of the things that we know is the more that we talk negatively about public education, the more people's perception is that public education isn't doing a good job. It's bad. It's a terrible profession to be in. So we also have to be really great ambassadors of the importance of it. But back to what I mentioned earlier, this sort of environment that people are teaching and working in, we have to be willing as citizens and as educators of higher ed to really step up and support and work with our local communities to create environments where I can teach and have my academic freedom and be able to engage in difficult conversations, not out of bounds, not out of lines, but in those right ways, and really training them, as Dr. Harper talked about, because I know USC, we have good programs that really do make sure that equity and racial understanding is part of our curriculum, but that is not the case everywhere. And I also think that one of the things we don't do a good job of is differentiation. And by that, I mean, we do prepare people for sort of one environment, but having been a superintendent who has served in high poverty, low wealth, very diverse disparate kinds of communities, how do we then bring people together to say, if you're in this kind of a situation, here are the skills that are going to help you. We really don't, we still do a one size kind of fits all, I think, in education as we prepare our leaders and our teachers. And we really got to think about that. How do we give people the tools, not just have the background and the understanding, but the process, the communication skills, really transfer those skills to any setting.
And Pedro, I would just add that leadership is in some sense so much more important now, right? So if you're the captain of a ship and the waters are calm, it doesn't matter who the captain of the ship is. But if you've been attacked by pirates or there's a stormy waters, then it really matters who the captain is, right? So in some sense, like it really matters who's in school leadership right now, because we're not in calm waters. So I think we really need smart people with good judgment to be leading our schools and not be quitting, because we need them more now than at any other time.
So that's a great metaphor of the captain of the ship during a storm or when it's under attack. But I want to go back to you, Niraj, because when you laid out those principles, you didn't give us very clear guidance, right? That is, you didn't definitively say, get the kids vaccinated if they're over 12. Make sure everyone's vaccinated or they don't come to school. Make sure everyone wears masks. We're seeing districts right here in LA that have issued those kind of mandates because they can't take a wishy-washy position. They have to be decisive about under what conditions schools will operate. As a scientist who's studying this, what do you think about that? Lend these superintendents some clear advice.
Okay, so let's think about mask mandates and kind of I'll try to walk them through my decision-making process, right? So the first thing you want to understand is what is the risk of COVID for children, right? Because with mask mandates, what you're trying to do is prevent COVID in children. So you really want to understand how bad is COVID for children. So if you go to the American Academy of Pediatrics website, they're the trusted source of information on COVID hospitalization rates or mortality rates for children. They collect data from a bunch of states to do that. So now I want all of you to think about, what do you think is the chance that if your kid got COVID, that they would be hospitalized? Think of that number in your head, and I'll tell you what the number from the American Academy of Pediatrics is. The answer is it's 1 in 1,000. So if your kid got COVID and you had some symptoms, so you got the kid tested, so it's a confirmed case of COVID, there's a 1 in 1,000 chance that a confirmed case of COVID in a child will lead to a hospitalization. And we know that there are a lot of kids who get COVID who don't even know about it. There's a lot of asymptomatic COVID in children. So probably the true rate of hospitalization for children with COVID is way below 1 in 1,000, right? Similarly, what's the mortality rate for COVID, for confirmed cases of COVID in children? Think of that number in your head. And the answer is it's 1 in 10,000. So if there are 10,000 kids with COVID, one of them is going to die from it, right? So now, if you look at the research on mask mandates, there are 2 studies that have done that. Both studies, one was done by the CDC, and the other was done by an eminent economist from Brown University. Both of those studies found a statistically insignificant effect of mask mandates for children. So by statistically insignificant means we couldn't tell whether the effect was because of luck or because of the mask mandate. So it doesn't mean mask mandates don't work. It just means.
Well, what about children as COVID spreaders?
Yes.
To immunocompromised children and adults in school or at their home, because kids are living with grandparents and others who may be fragile.
Mm-hmm. So first, let's just look at, suppose mask mandates actually work, right? And they prevent, so over the last year, we've had 5 million COVID cases in children, right? So children do get COVID, 5 million of them got COVID. Let's assume mask mandates work and we save 1 million COVID cases in children, right? If you look at the mortality rate, that means we are saving 100 children lives, right? So 100 children would not die of COVID because of mask mandates. But you got to look at that number in the context of overall number, which is how many children die in the US from accidental deaths, right? And what will the mask mandate do to the education of the child? If it's for 2 weeks, maybe nothing. But if it's for the whole of next year, it might be very different, right? And so then it becomes, how do you do those trade-offs, right? And then it becomes kind of each individual choice. So, and Pedro, to your question, yes, there are kids who are immunocompromised who would benefit from a mask mandate, but there are also kids who are suffering from anxiety and depression who would like to see faces, right? There are kids who get migraines who would like to see faces. So now it becomes like, how do you value their all these different kids' welfare? And we're imposing something, right? We're not saying like kids should not wear masks. We're saying every kid, like it or not, has to wear a mask. And that is very different decision than you can decide to wear a mask or not. And I'm sure like 80% of the people will still wear a mask without a mandate, right?
Okay,
Because people will make their personal choices.
cut you off
Shaun
there
wants
'cause I
to
gotta-
jump in.
But thank you, Niraj, for that very thorough response. Let me go back to Shaun. Shaun, you know, I think you made it clear, CRT is not the issue. What the issue is race and how we teach about race in schools. And it's pretty clear that we have a contentious society around these issues. And you know, as we've seen over and over again in the states that have adopted these laws, there's an attempt to kind of silence a certain part of our history. For board members and superintendents who are trying to figure out what to do, what kind of guidance would you provide?
So you're the dean and you get to ask the questions. But before I answer, could I ask Niraj just one quick question, please? All right, so Niraj, actually, okay, 2 quick questions. All right, so I appreciate your reliance on data, right? This is important. One thing I want to ask though, right? If only 100 children will die, what if your kid is one of those 100 kids?
So,
right?
Yeah, so if my kid is one of those 100 kids, it would be unlucky and I would be devastated. But you got to still put this in context. So for example, 12,000 children die in the US from accidental deaths, right? So now do I say that, suppose your kid could wear a helmet when you're driving a car, should we mandate helmets? It would save brain injuries. It would probably save more than 100 lives if I mandate every kid wear a helmet when they drive in a car, because motor vehicle accidents cause a lot of deaths. But we make these trade-offs in our lives where we say, no, I care about the comfort of my kid. I don't want my kid to wear a helmet. I'm taking that small chance that my kid will suffer an adverse event, right? Or I care about my kids' interaction with their friends. So for example, if I had to make a decision for my kid, I would tell my kid not to wear a mask, but my kid still wants to wear a mask because she's like, I want to fit in with my friends. I like wearing a mask. It doesn't bother me. Dad, leave me alone, right? So, but it's very different for me to say, hey, Shaun, I want your kids to wear a mask. For me, if I have to say that, the burden of evidence has to be very strong for me to tell someone else's kids to do something. So that's kind of where, at least where I stand.
Okay, all right. My second thing is not a question, it's just a reaction. I haven't seen the data, the CDC data that you were quoting, but I fully expect that there is racial disproportionality in the infections and in the mortality among young children. So because there's been racial disproportionality with adults. So I fully expect the same to be true with children. And we have to think about, children of color, lower income children, and so on. All right, so Pedro, you asked me a question about school leaders and school boards. The truth is that leaders and their boards are finally starting to learn alongside each other about race and racial equity. We have the privilege of doing and facilitating some of that learning here at the center in our work with boards and school leaders. Julie Marsh and I co-advise James Bridgeforth, a PhD student here, who is writing a phenomenal phenomenal dissertation actually on crisis leadership, racial crisis leadership. I think we have to use James's research to help school leaders and boards understand the penalties and the vulnerabilities and the liabilities, right, of not teaching young people about race, right? We have to also help them understand how to get ahead of racial crises before they occur. Avoidance is not the way to get ahead of those crises. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. So, let me go back to well, I'll throw this out to the panel, because one of the questions we've gotten is about the role of unions. And teacher unions, especially in our cities, have weighed in very heavily and said they want masks, they want vaccines. And that's part of the reason. And it's a lot responding to fears of their members. And so, from a policy standpoint, but also from a practical standpoint, how do we, we're dealing with an issue that's political as well. How do we address the fact that there are organized groups that are taking very clear positions on these issues? How do we figure that into this? Anyone?
I think, again, it's a difficult thing. I don't know how we figure it out. But one of the things I would say is it's important to highlight what the trade-offs are, right? So if a union says we want to keep schools closed because it keeps our members safe, there should be a parent group or someone else saying, yes, that's true, but that has an impact on our children. And going to kind of Shaun's point, school closures affected lower income neighborhoods, children of color, much more than children in higher income neighborhoods who had more resources, more access to Zoom. Their parents were working from home and could support it and so on. So we need to kind of at least make those trade-offs clear. And then we can have arguments and discussions about, how do we weigh those costs and benefits? But I think we haven't done that. We've tried to kind of toe a line and say, yes, public health says this is good, so we're all going to just go with that, rather than have a discussion about these trade-offs.
I guess
Julie,
it begs the question.
Oh, go ahead, Shaun.
I think it begs the question for me, trade-offs for whom? So far in this conversation, we've talked a lot about teachers and school leaders, but let's take a moment to talk about staff, and more specifically, the racial stratification of most K-12 schools and districts across the country. The truth is, most of the people who work in the lowest paid, least powerful roles within schools and districts are people of color. We're talking maintenance workers, custodial workers, food service workers, and so on. Those folks, we have to be concerned about their safety as well, right? And when we don't honor and privilege their voices in these conversations and in the policy that gets made in response, I think that we put ourselves once again at risk of further exacerbating racial inequity.
Can I just add to that? Because I was going to say the same thing, which is that we need adults in these buildings in order to provide the academic piece of what you're talking about in these trade-offs, Niraj. And so we have shortages going on in schools around the country because we can't find folks who want to be in schools and put themselves at risk, particularly in states that don't have mask mandates, that have low vaccination rates. And then the education of all the kids in those buildings are suffering. I mean, I have friends teaching in schools where they still have no one teaching the history class, no one teaching the English class, no one helping in the office because they cannot find adults who want to be teaching in these places. So to me, I think, organized labor is really important in this situation because we need these folks to actually provide the services that we intended, which was an education for these kids. So I think it's really important to be factoring that into this conversation, 100%.
No, I agree. And I think we just need to consider all options, right? So for example, I completely agree. We got to protect teachers and school staff, everyone who's working in schools. And so if you want to do a vaccine mandate for teachers and school staff, because vaccinating teachers and staff helps them, and it doesn't hurt the child's education. But if you say, I'm going to close a school because I want to protect, then there is a massive trade-off. Yes, we are improving their safety, but we are hurting our children. And so I think we need to look at all options and say, what's an option where we can achieve as many goals as we want to achieve, right? That overall, for all the different stakeholders, this kind of makes sense. And maybe different people will come to, different districts or, communities will come to different decisions about it. But I think we need to just highlight all what the trade-offs are, right? And that's why I said it's not easy. Like, we cannot have a world in which education is maximized, staff safety is maximized, staff satisfaction is like, that world doesn't exist. We'll have to make trade-offs, and just knowing what those are and discussing them will help us get to better decisions.
So
If I can just jump in as
Go
the
ahead, Sandy.
practitioner here. So here's what's so challenging, right? I appreciate all of that. And we want to have all these opportunities to take all of this information in, create some sort of accordion process that allows us to go wide and then massage what we're going to do and bring it back out to the bigger, larger group. But the reality is there's not a lot of time. And so as we talk about all these theoretical explorations that we want to do and all the discussions and conversations we want to have in real time, parents and board members are saying, get kids back in seats, make our schools safe. Unions are saying, here's the stuff that we need to have happen. And so school officials and boards are put in a really challenging position. So I think that's one of the things that we need some unanimity around some of these decisions, so that you are not pitting individuals against individuals. We need our labor partners there. We need our school board officials and their organizations, there are administrators, our staff. We need all those folks there. And as a superintendent, I need them to feel safe in their work environment. I need them to feel supported. We want our people to be able to do the best work they can to support our students. So I used to tell my staff, if it was that easy, we'd have done it. If there was a recipe, we'd follow it. But this is messy, difficult, challenging work that when you're really in the seat that's under fire, as these folks are, to get all these people to the table, and especially as we talked about earlier, in these times where we are not engaged in good discourse, we are not listening to each other as if our minds can be changed. We are going in with an agenda and a position, and we want to exercise that and have that put in place. That makes the work that our school boards and our school leaders and our teachers and support staff are doing so much harder. And that's what we've got to figure out. And the other thing I just want to say is, as much as people are unhappy with how things have gone in this last 15 months, I still say kudos to the educators out there who are asked to pivot overnight. I would lay in bed and wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning just thinking, oh my gosh, how are we going to do this? It was a real pressure. We hold up our phones and get frustrated if the call fails, because that's how immediate and rapid we expect everything to be in this world. We're not there, and school systems aren't there for sure. And we've got to get better. We need to be better at serving all of our students and meeting the needs of each of the students that sits in those seats. And we've got to figure out how to give the community to give us some space and grace to do that work, to make those changes and implement the things that we need to for our kids.
So in most places now, schools are open for in-person instruction. And so those mental health issues that we've heard about are in full display. We're seeing kids who were in isolation for a long period of time, bringing their anxieties to school, and schools are not well equipped in many cases to respond to the needs, on top of the political controversies. What advice would you offer to the educators who are seeing firsthand and who themselves may be under great stress about how to address these needs that they're seeing in their children, their students? That's to any of the panelists.
I agree with Sandra. Like, schools are just going through a lot, right? They're dealing with parents who are unhappy. They're dealing with an epidemic of anxiety and depression in their children. They're dealing with similar issues in their staff. they have to now not only be a school, but also be a public health agency and do testing. So they're at like their breaking point. They don't know what to do. And they're like, I've had like several, conversations where they're just like, we need help. And I kind of agree with Sandra that what they're saying is, look, yes, in an ideal world, we would like to make our own decisions and come up with our own plan that meets our community, but we just don't have the bandwidth for that. So we want some sort of like central leadership that takes care of stuff for us, that just tells us what to do, and so that we have a plan and we'll kind of follow that. And I just don't know, like, for example, like what to do with this unprecedented mental health crisis in schools. I think it's just a very tough situation. We need to give more attention, devote more resources to that. And that's what I was saying, that we need to be thinking about overall well-being. And maybe, there are some resources that are tied up with COVID testing in environments where testing doesn't make sense. We need to divert them to mental health for children. And that's again where those trade-offs come into play.
Go ahead, anybody else? Julie?
Yeah, I was just going to add. So one, I think we need to make sure that the adults are taking care of themselves before anything. And I do worry about their mental health. And I think there are programs out there to get support. I know LA County Office of Ed has some programs, and the county mental health. Like, I just think there are places out there, and we need to get information out to make sure that our educators are actually being supported for their well-being, to actually help the students with their well-being. I think that we need to lean on other partners. So I think our universities can play roles. I think there's a community-based organizations that need to be playing roles. I don't think we need to be putting this all on the educators to be trying to sort this out. So those would be some of my thoughts in particular right now.
And Sandra, you want to add anything about on this? Because you're seeing again schools being called upon to address issues that go well beyond academics.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, to Julie's point, I think it's kind of like the oxygen mask on the airplane, right? You got to get oxygen first before you can help other people. And we really have to make sure we're doing that for our adults. If I had any descriptor that I've heard used more to describe superintendents and all staff at schools, it's fragile. And so I think we all alluded to that we know, mental health of our students is a concern, but so is our staff. And I think systems and boards need to look at where they are right now with expectations. And you know how it is, we put more stuff on people's plates. We almost never take something off. This is a really good time to reevaluate and say, are there things that we can pull off of people's plates and give them some space, give them time, make sure there's access to mental health. I think a lot of school districts are actually really cognizant of that right now and are doing that work and making sure that people are plugged into the supports that are there so that they can then care for their students. And then the only other thing I would say is, I know CSBA is stepping up, but school board officials are not often trained. They get very little training. I mean, they get that over time if they sit in the seat for a while, but very often, and we've got a lot of new school board members in this state who are coming in, they may have never had a governance training session. And suddenly they are sitting in these positions where they're making public health decisions, policy decisions, they're looking at educational decisions that are going to impact kids going forward. And so I do think we need to think more about how we prep and prepare and ongoing support for those individuals that's easy to access and that helps them do a better job because they serve such an important function.
Yeah, I'll just add here quickly that we also have to be nuanced and intersectional in the supports that we create for educators, leaders, and students. Sandy said that, the word that she's hearing most often is fragile. The word that I'm hearing most often among educators and educational leaders, especially educators of color, is exhausted. They're feeling absolutely exhausted, not just from all of the sort of things that they're responsible for, multitasking that are, pandemic related, but also the racial stress that still lingers from summer 2020 and the ongoing, racial trauma, racial stereotypes, and, racial inequity that confronts them. And it hits women of color, especially hard right? Because there's then the intersectionality of race and gender for them. So yeah, I think that we have to tend to the exhaustion that educators of color are feeling in a really nuanced and intersectional way.
So let me ask you this, Shaun, as a follow-up, because several of the questions we've received are about training. What kind of training teachers, board members, and Sandy alluded to board members getting training, particularly on the question of race, which keeps coming up. You spoke before about the inadequacy of preparation, but now they're there and now they've got a deal. What could we do to help them in a kind of on-time way to contend with some of these controversies?
Sure. A curriculum has to get developed. It can't be a one-time training or some sort of one-time PD with the board or with teachers and staff in the school. I facilitated a day-long training for a K-12 school board about 2 months ago. And this is not a critique of that particular board, because the truth is what I experienced with them is quite consistent with, my interactions with other boards over the years. The truth is, Pedro, those folks were asking me like very, very basic questions like, is it Latino or Hispanic? Or is it Black or African American? I mean, they really were at sort of like race 1.0. We got to get people beyond sort of the introductory sort of here are the racial terms to higher order thinking and problem solving on these issues. And there has to be a curricular approach for adults. It can't be one-off PDs.
And if I can just build on that, I so agree. And going back to the governance role, boards need to be able to, and superintendents as their partners in that governance team, put in place policy that then creates the expectation that those actions happen. We did pass a policy right before I retired for our board now to hold accountable the entire district and district staff to make sure these things are happening. We had a forum, an anti-racism coalition, ARC, that we put together that's still a group that's working since my retirement, but we had 50 people at every meeting, 60 people sometimes, because people are hungry for these conversations and they want to know more. And to Shaun's point, they aren't well versed in some of just the basic terminology, much less the thinking and the analysis that needs to happen to say, hey, what does this look like in our district? Are we really serving all students in the way that we should be? Are we supporting all staff in the way that we should be? So I think people are really, really ripe and ready for that conversation. And back to the discussion about CRT, I think as educators and governing boards, if they have the right language and they themselves get the benefit of that kind of a board workshop, it really helps them then respond to those folks who are coming in a very organized fashion to school districts and school board rooms to challenge those boards. And so I'm really glad to hear Shaun's doing that work, and more districts need that kind of support and that kind of training so that they're ready and prepared to say what they're doing, what it is, and also, deny what it isn't and what these folks are asserting that they're doing that's really not happening in classrooms.
Can I jump in with us also thinking more long-term rather than short-term? So I think we need to be thinking about the future leaders of our school districts that are primarily white at this point. So I think we need to be encouraging more diverse educational leaders who mirror the diversity that we have in our communities. And there's actually quite an opportunity right now if you think about some of the turnover that's occurring. So I think we need some really intentional efforts about building a pipeline of racially diverse leadership in our schools and school systems. That would be one thing. I also think I want to make sure that we get back to like some of the issues I brought up at the start, which is about how are we going to get people to be actually able to talk to one another and bridge some of these divides. And I would really like us to think more about the students, and let's start training our students in our schools to be thinking about these issues in nuanced ways. So not just on the racism front, which I think is really important in our moral responsibility to be really teaching about the realities of racism, but I think we need to be thinking about the sort of civic education and the education around how to be civil with one another, how to listen to other people's viewpoints, how to actually debate the facts, how to be actually like data and information literate, to consider the science and the evidence, to engage in what Niraj is trying to tell us to do. Like, I think we need to work on the next generation to be working on these big controversies that we're talking about today. And that's going to take also curriculum and efforts right now in our schools.
Thank you for that reminder of how important learning about how to engage in civil discourses to education. And I think that this is what many board members are striving for. But when you're faced with angry mobs, it's really hard to insist upon civility. So we've laid out the issues, but I'm a little concerned because our audience out there is asking for some guidance. They're asking for help in figuring out how to solve, how to address the anger. And I'm wondering if anyone would want to offer some sense of guidance about, you used the metaphor before, Niraj, of the ship at sea that's under attack by the pirates. Well, that's happening right now. Board members are under attack, sometimes physically, and they're receiving threats, and they're saying, this job is not worth it. So I'm wondering, what should we do? What kind of advice do we offer those who are really contemplating whether or not to just leave this low-paying job on the board? Shaun, you pointed out that our essential workers are usually our lowest paid workers. In New York City, 420 bus drivers died of COVID. I want you to think about, they died driving the bus every day. So this is not, these are real lives, real people, and real decisions have to be made that have consequences. So we're looking for guidance now because we're a university. We have hopefully the benefit of access to knowledge to guide our decision-making. And I think our public is looking for that guidance. So in the last 7 minutes we have, any final thoughts, wisdom about how to approach this in a way that allows us to hopefully make good, sound decisions, but also reduce some of the rancor?
So I'll attempt to tackle this first. With the attack on critical race theory, my approach has been to extend an invitation. I invite people to find me 50 teachers in the US who are teaching CRT. I also invite them to do an analysis of the curriculum in your school, in your district. Do an analysis of the curriculum and map for me where the teaching and learning about race is occurring. And I invite you to then come back and show me your work, show me your curricular map, right? I invite you to engage with me about the things that you've read that actually are critical race theory, pieces that are written by actual critical race theorists. I invite you to first tell me, who are the folks that you've read? And let's talk about specifically what of their work have you read and what about it do you find problematic? And furthermore, can you show me where this particular Derek Bell article that you find disagreeable is being taught in a K-12 school? Oh, wait, I invite you to, find for me where that's happening. I know that sounds, really sort of condescending. Maybe it is, right? I'm just gonna own that. But it's my way of like putting the work back on the intellectually lazy person who is critiquing a thing that they haven't read, who's critiquing a thing for which there is no evidence in the curricular map that there's teaching and learning happening. So that's been my approach. Yeah.
I love those ideas. I'm thinking about something more structural. Like I'm thinking about the board meeting as a structure. Like, is that the most effective way for us to be hearing from our constituents? I know it's an efficient way, but is it the best way for us, particularly in times when people are coming to just yell and sort of there's not a lot of sort of dialogue that occurs. And I'm trying to figure out, are there ways that we could create more opportunities where there's listening occurring? I mean, people are coming with their minds made up, but no one's listening to one another. So I guess I put this on as a challenge to all of us to be thinking about, how do we engage the community and our stakeholders in ways beyond the board meeting, or that you submit your views, where we could have some more dialogue. And I think back to the work that I've done around local control funding formula, where we engaged communities around thinking about our goals. And the best places where they actually had some listening, where those were occurring in sort of smaller settings, where superintendents would sort of go out to churches or go to, sort of smaller to the school level and really listen, and that there was this sort of two-way communication. I'd like us to think about more ways to be creating those kinds of opportunities to be airing out and hearing one another.
I would kind of, second what Julie said, that I think the way to kind of reduce polarization is not by giving more facts, because that doesn't help. I think the way to reduce that is to actually get to know the other side and actually have social interaction. So I want to have friends who have very different opinions than me, because as long as I know they're my friend, I trust them as a person, I'm more willing to listen to them. If I don't know them at all, I'm going to assume the worst about them and I'm not going to listen to them. So I think the way to kind of really reduce this gridlock is to actually have a beer, hang out with people who have very different opinions than you. Because once you understand that they're also people like you, they have the same motivations, but they're arriving at different conclusions, you're still more willing to listen to them because they're good people. And I think right now we're kind of in our own worlds where we hang out with people who agree with us. That's comforting, but that's why we're polarized, because we don't hang out with, there was this interesting story about why Congress became more polarized. And one of the theories was, Republicans and Democrats would hang out socially in the evenings, like during the weekends. And then Newt Gingrich came in and he said, no, you're going to go back to your districts. And that hanging out at the weekend stopped. And then you were no longer friends. And that led to kind of this polarization. So I think some of that is happening in our society. So I try to kind of make friends with people who I don't agree with. I also do make friends with people who I agree with, because it's fun to, all agree together and think we're all right. That's fun too. I know. I partake in that too.
I was going to ask if you've had any conversations with anti-vaxxers and nice civil conversations.
I've tried to listen to radio shows where anti-vaxxers have called in to kind of give their, explanation for it. And it has been enlightening,
Sandra, you get the last word here.
Yeah, I just so agree that it's those small settings, those opportunities to get with people who don't share your views and ideas. A board meeting is not a town hall. It is a business meeting in public. And so you do have to create those forums and those opportunities for folks to get together, see eye to eye. Challenge has been the Zoom, technology. It's a wonderful platform. We're glad to have all these virtual opportunities. But the reality is we can't look in each other's eyes. We don't get to have that same kind of human connection. And so I hope we can get back to that, and people need to get out and they need to talk. And the last thing I'll say is have a consistent structure in your boardroom. It's one of the best ways to make sure that when things happen, you have a plan for it and you're able to set a consistent expectation as a community.
So I want to thank all of our panelists for such enlightening, thoughtful comments. Tough issues we're talking about. There aren't easy answers. But I think the last comments we heard about the importance of listening, dialogue, engagement is key if we're going to keep democracy alive. I want to thank the audience. We had over 200 people who checked in, and we were also on Facebook Live. Thank Wendy Shattuck and the Communications Department and Kanae Daniels for all their help in making this happen. And look forward to the next conversation. Our schools still are the most accessible institution in our country, and how we support public education, I think, is key to the kind of country we live in. So thank you all, and appreciate your time, and we look forward to the next one.